Welcome, wanderers of wisdom. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Type your city or country below. I love seeing how far knowledge travels. Now sink into a comfortable position, slow your breathing, and let's drift back to ancient Alexandria, where the people of the Mediterranean tried something audacious, to gather all human knowledge in one place. Breathe in gently and imagine the horizon paling from indigo to pearl as the eastern sky lifts itself over the sea. You're standing on a marble quay at the edge of a young city that already thinks in grand, ancient terms. The air smells of salt and warm stone. Ships creak against their moorings. Somewhere behind you, a vendor folds cloth dyed in brilliant Tyrian purple. Ahead, gulls rake the wind, and beyond them rises a tower so tall it seems to test the patience of the clouds. This is Alexandria at daybreak, a city conceived in a moment of ambition and built to outlast memory. Its story begins with a conqueror pausing long enough to imagine permanence. In 331 BCE, Alexander the Great stepped onto a narrow neck of land between the Mediterranean and the reed-fringed waters of Lake Mareotis. He traced a plan into the sand, so the later stories say, selecting a place where ships could tuck into calm harbours and caravans could drink after crossing the Saharan fringes. The urban design followed a rational Greek grid, broad and airy, with a great spine of roadway called the Canopic Way running east to west. The architect Dinocrates is often credited with turning the rough plan into stone, aligning streets to gather sea breezes and spill light into colonnades. Where older cities grew by accident, this one was drafted with a ruler. After Alexander's early death, the city passed to one of his generals, Ptolemy, who crowned himself king and then pharaoh, adopting Egyptian regalia with Greek confidence. Under the Ptolemies, Alexandria swelled. Builders threw a causeway, the Heptastadion, across the water to tether the island of Pharos to the mainland, splitting the sea into two deep harbours. On the tip of Pharos rose the famous lighthouse, clad in pale stone, stacked in geometric tiers, and capped with a fire whose moving brightness could be seen by captains far offshore. At night, the beacon swung in slow, dependable arcs, a metronome for mariners. By day, it was a declaration written in architecture. This city intends to be found. From the first, Alexandria was not a single culture with ornamental additions, but a braid. Egyptians, Greeks, Phoenicians, Cypriots, Jews, Nubians, and travellers from farther still stepped into the same light. The Greek language served as the shared medium of scholarship and commerce, but other tongues pressed alongside it in markets and side streets. In the shadowy coolness of temple courts, Egyptian priests recited ancient hymns. In porticos facing the sea, philosophers argued in Attic turns of phrase. In workshops, artisans swore in whatever dialect shortened the workday. The Ptolemies cultivated this mixture, but also organised it, appointing officials to manage the city's quarters, mint coins, regulate grain shipments, and patrol the bustling waterfronts where Mediterranean trade breathed in and out. The geography made the ambition feasible. With one face toward the open sea and the other to the slow, blue ribbon of the Nile and the inland lake behind it, Alexandria became a hinge between worlds. Grain barges drifted down the Nile's branches to the lake, where warehouses rose in ranks. From there, goods moved through channels to the harbours and onto ships bound for Rhodes, Antalya, Athens, and beyond. The docks clattered with amphora full of oil and wine, baskets of figs and dates, ingots, papyrus sheets rolled like pale green thunderbolts, and crated glass that caught the sun in sudden flashes. Sailors traded weather lore from Cilicia. Merchants tallied accounts with wax tablets. Customs agents tapped seals and stamped clay tags. Wealth accumulated, and with it, the possibility to sponsor something rarer than monuments. Time for thinking. The Mouseion, the place of the muses, grew from that possibility. It functioned as a research campus with living stipends, dining rooms, courtyards where the wind could clear a mind caught in a hard problem, and anchoring it all, a library unlike any attempted before. The project was simple to say and vast to enact. Gather the texts of the known world, compare them, correct them, and preserve them. Under Ptolemy I and Ptolemy II, agents were dispatched to coastal markets and inland sanctuaries to find works by poets, physicians, lawgivers, astronomers, historians, dramatists, and mathematicians. The city made a habit of interception. When a ship docked with books on board, scribes hurried to copy them. The originals, the story goes, stayed, and the copies returned to the owners, a policy that could irritate but also announced a new hierarchy. Alexandria's commitment to memory ranked higher than the convenience of travellers. Because the dream was not only to collect but to refine, the city developed techniques to make reading precise. Scribes wrote on papyrus manufactured from the marsh plant that crowded the Nile. Workers peeled the pith into thin strips, laid them in perpendicular layers, pressed them, and dried them into sheets that could be pasted edge to edge in long scrolls. The ink, soot and water, thickened with gum, flowed from split reed pens. Titles dangled from the ends of scrolls on small tags, and the rolls stood upright in wooden cabinets, each compartment labelled. Margins were left generous. Scholars needed places to whisper to the future, to puzzle over a line, to note where a scribe's ear had mistaken one word for another. Different versions of the same work were collated. A single tragedian's play might exist in multiple city editions. The Alexandrian habit was to compare them all, keep what fit the metre and sense and mark what did not. In the streets beyond the scholarly quarters, the city expressed itself with equal grandeur. The Canopic Way stretched broad and straight, a parade route for ideas as much as for festivals. Colonnades threw shade for walkers and peddlers. Public fountains sang in cool basins. The Serapeion rose on its acropolis, a temple to a god fashioned from a deliberate fusion. The bull deity Apis reimagined as Serapis, with Greek iconography and Egyptian roots. The cult was less an erasure than a deliberate bridge, a sign that rulers and priests were testing a shared religious grammar for their mixed city. Theatre performances drew crowds smelling of sea salt and myrrh. In gymnasia, youths learned to wrestle and recite. In the royal quarter, gardens stitched together rare plants from different climates, the earth itself persuaded into demonstration. Power made all of this stable and fragile. The Ptolemies ruled with a double script, Greek administration and Egyptian ceremony, and they required loyalty from priestly hierarchies in the Nile Valley. In return, they invested in the great grain machine, ensuring that harvests could be measured, taxed, stored, and shipped. The city's nilometer, the instrument for reading the river's flood, told rulers how generous or severe to be in levies, and thereby fed not just Alexandria but distant mouths across the Mediterranean. In winter, when storms bullied the sea lanes, warehouses swelled. In spring, when the winds settled, port scribes recorded the outward surge of ships that tied Alexandria to hungry markets. To live here was to feel the calendar in your bones, the coming of the Etesian winds, the pulse of the flood, the season when scholars closed shutters against dust rising from the Libyan quarter, the days when figs were sweetest. As the population grew, neighbourhoods took on distinct textures. Near the harbours, inns and taverns made a polyglot music. In artisan quarters, glassmakers blew shimmering vessels that caught the city's light and seemed to hold it. Metalworkers hammered fittings for ships and hinges for doors that opened onto courtyards full of lemon trees. In markets, Egyptian basketry nested beside Greek pottery. Perfume sellers learned to name their own blends in multiple languages to satisfy an audience that craved both novelty and assurance. Bakers perfected loaves that travelled well on sea journeys. Librarians stopped for olives on their way back to their scrolls, and physicians bargained for fresh herbs before returning to lecture halls where students argued over pulses and fevers. The rhythms of learning found their place within these civic beats. Morning began cool and bright. A mathematician could chase a proof before the day's heat made the mind drowsy. Midday brought shared meals at the Mausion, stipended, simple, abundant, where a philologist might share a table with a geographer and a physician. In the afternoon, as the sun drifted, the collation rooms came alive. 3 copies of a poet laid side by side, lines tested against metre, sense, and the stubborn facts of grammar. In the evening, someone read aloud in a courtyard while swifts knitted the air high overhead. On some nights, the lighthouse fire far across the water seemed to echo the city's quieter flame, an attention that refused to go out. Infrastructure overlapped with imagination in practical ways. The Heptastadion, that long causeway, did more than link shore to island. It redirected currents, changed silt patterns, and created a basin that sheltered ships. Engineers took note. They measured, recorded, and argued over how water behaved when forced through narrow mouths. Harbour pilots who learned by feel could talk with scholars who learned by numbers. The conversation produced better maps, better mooring practices, and inevitably better stories about how the sea chose its moods. The city's great lighthouse doubled as an observatory. By night, the horizon was a dome pricked with bright questions. Astronomers climbed its steps to obtain a steadier sky. Below them, fishermen lit small braziers at the ends of their boats and learned to love the same silence for different reasons. The dead were not absent here. Somewhere in the royal quarter, a mausoleum, often called the Sema, was said to hold Alexander's body, a focus for visitors who wanted to touch the origin story. Pilgrims and dignitaries came to pay respects, and gossip said that some rulers could not resist lifting the lid for a closer look. Whether the tales were exaggerated hardly mattered. The shrine gave the city a shrine-like attention. It fused memory and politics and reminded citizens that the city's plan was drafted by a man whose horizon never stopped expanding. To walk past it on your way to a lecture was to feel your spine straighten. Over time, institutions refined themselves. The library learned to catalogue not just by author, but by subject and opening line. Notice was taken of variant titles, of spurious attributions, of works rumoured but lost. Scholars developed diacritical marks to clarify pronunciation and sense. They argued with the kind of carefulness that makes progress through inches rather than proclamations. To listeners, the disputes could seem minute, this accent or that, this reading or another, but the effect was cumulative. Texts became sturdier under the pressure. Plays were easier to stage, hymns easier to sing, recipes less likely to poison, astronomical tables less likely to mislead navigators caught between stars and storm. All of this took money, patience, and a civic ethos that treated curiosity as a common good. The Ptolemies provided patronage, but the city responded with participation. Merchants gave tips about bookstalls in foreign ports. Sea captains brought rumours of new treatises on mechanics from Sicily. Priests from Upper Egypt explained rituals whose cadences reached back millennia, allowing translators to choose gentler equivalents in Greek. Visiting dignitaries arrived with gifts, sometimes a gilded bowl, sometimes a battered scroll rescued from a ship's damp locker. The library's shelves learned to welcome both. If you walk the streets again, the light has changed. The sun sits higher now. Children race beneath colonnades and chase their shadows. A fisherman snores in the shade of an overturned skiff. A scholar carries 3 scrolls like sleeping birds, careful not to bend their edges. From an open doorway you hear a lecture drift to its end. The soft pause as a teacher looks up. The scrape of benches, the scuffle of sandals. Knowledge here is not a hoard, but a climate. It hangs in the air, it hardens into customs, it softens tempers and sharpens questions. And always the lighthouse stands with its long hand raised, reminding every sailor and every student that orientation matters, that knowing where you are is the beginning of knowing anything at all. Night will come again, the fire will bloom on Pharos, the sea will settle into its black silk, and the city will breathe at a slower tempo. In houses and dormitories, candles will lean into their last inches of wick while a reader follows a line to its end and another copyist steadies his hand for one more character. Somewhere a geographer will set down a measure of distance that no one has yet walked. Somewhere a poet will repair a hemistich so that it falls like water instead of stumbling like a cart. And in the morning, when the gulls begin their work and the marble quays wake to the first footsteps, Alexandria will start the experiment again. A city designed to catch whatever the world knows and keep it long enough to pass it on. The experiment began as a conversation between power and curiosity. A new dynasty needed legitimacy. A new city needed a soul. In the cool rooms of the palace quarter, an exiled Athenian named Demetrius of Phalerum, philosopher, statesman, collector of books, spoke with the first Ptolemies about an institution that would gather the wisdom of the world and make it work. Not a shrine that merely stored offerings, but a living campus where knowledge would be fed, walked, argued with, and copied. The plan unfurled along colonnades and courtyards, a Mausion, the place of the muses, with resident scholars, a steady stipend, shared meals, and the crown of it all, a library whose shelves curved like a horizon. Architecture carried the idea into stone. Within the royal district, the Mausion spread like a calm thought. Peristyles where footsteps softened, lecture halls with benches polished by elbows, exedrae for debate, and a long-covered walk, the peripatos, where a mind could stretch alongside the body. At the centre stood altars to the 9 muses, a reminder that the work was consecrated to inspiration itself. A priest of the muses, appointed by the king, oversaw the institution. Below him, a community of scholars formed something like a college. They received apartments, exemption from certain taxes, and a seat at the common table. The daily ritual was as practical as it was sacred. Eat together, read together, argue together, and write so the next person can begin further along. The library, attached to this complex, was the instrument that made the dream measurable. Rolls of papyrus stood upright in wooden cupboards, armaria, each cubby labelled with tags that dangled from the scrolls, announcing titles and authors in a tidy hand. The rooms were dry and orderly, washed in indirect light to protect ink and fibre. Scribes trained to a tempo set by long practice. Prepare the reed pen, deepen the ink with soot and gum, align the papyrus sheets so fibres bore the strain of the line, copy, check, correct. At the head of this living machine stood the librarian, a title that meant not clerk but architect of texts, judge of variants, planner of acquisitions, and tutor in the methods that make reading scientific. The first to wear that responsibility, so tradition tells, was Zenodotus of Ephesus. He took the greatest weight immediately, Homer. The epics had drifted for centuries in the mouths of rhapsodes and city archives, sprouting local lines and patriotic expansions. Zenodotus gathered versions, compared them, and drew a line. He marked suspicious verses with an obelos, a horizontal spear in the margin, and used other signs to flag doubles or noteworthy passages. Where the meter stumbled or a formula repeated without purpose, he hesitated the pen and asked whether a scribe's ear had betrayed the line. He organised the poems into book divisions, established word forms, and composed glossaries of strange terms, turning a performance tradition into a text that could be taught, disputed, and transmitted with a little less drift. It was not perfection, and never could be, but it was a method, and a method can travel farther than a monument. Around him worked poets who were also librarians of a different sort. Callimachus, the sharp-eyed craftsman of brief, precise poems, performed a feat of order that rivaled any conquest. He made a map of the library for readers and librarians alike. The Pinax, an immense catalogue spread across roughly 120 rolls. Authors were arranged within genres: epic, tragedy, comedy, lyric, history, medicine, mathematics, philosophy, law, miscellanies, and alphabetized by name. Each entry carried a short biography, the opening words of a work, notes on authenticity and length, and, crucially, where to find it on the shelves. If an orator's style had soured with age, Callimachus might warn you. If a play came under a false name, he might unmask it. If two works shared a title, he would disambiguate by first lines. He built not a list, but an instrument for discovery. Whether he ever held the formal title of head librarian is debated. What is not in doubt is that he gave the library the nervous system through which it could feel itself. Acquisition policy had its own rhythm and its own legends. Royal agents haunted book markets from Athens to Rhodes, bargaining for clean copies and courting heirs who might part with the philosopher's papers. Sanctuary archives, with their dry, careful shelves, were asked, sometimes with gifts difficult to refuse, to lend official texts for copying. Ships that docked in Alexandria were invited briskly to hand over any books on board. The originals, so the story goes with a smile and a wince, stayed in Alexandria as from the ships, while immaculate copies returned to the owners. Another tale says, Ptolemy III borrowed the authenticated texts of Aeschylus, Sophocles and Euripides from Athens on a massive deposit, then accepted the loss of that deposit in order to keep the originals and send back copies. Anecdotes enlarge in the telling, but they all point to the same appetite. To know required not only collecting, but preferring the best witness, the cleanest line, the version closest to the writer's hand. Under Ptolemy II, the work deepened. Apollonius of Rhodes, remembered for his Argonautica, is sometimes listed among the library's leaders. He read his own poetry aloud to colleagues who knew too well the weight of the small decision. This epithet or that, this caesura or a later break. He argued, perhaps contentiously, with Callimachus about length and grandeur. The city had room for both the long journey and the sharp cut. The Mouseion encouraged such disagreements because it treated debate as a grindstone. In the mornings, a grammarian might harness the metrics of a lyric to examine where a scribe had misheard. In the afternoons, that same scholar could be found in the mathematics room peering at a diagram for a proof that refused to settle. A physician passing by corrected a technical term in a poem about herbs, and a poet, in turn, suggested a phrase to help a geographer name a wind. Then came Eratosthenes of Cyrene, polymath and patient measurer, called by friends Beta, second best at everything, and therefore good at almost anything. When he took the library's helm, he brought the same composure to text that he brought to the world. He compared chronologies across historians, forged a timeline that reconciled Athenian festivals with Egyptian regnal years, and made the word geography sit up straight. He measured the earth with shadows and distance, imagined a grid that could locate a city on a sphere, and saw that once you can place a thing, you can speak of it with more than wonder. In the library he organised, corrected and commissioned copies. Beyond its walls he reminded colleagues that the order on the shelves should mirror an order in the world. Aristophanes of Byzantium followed with the temper of a craftsman. He sprinkled accents and breathings across Greek words, diacritical marks that tell the voice how to rise and fall, how to aspirate or ease. He placed points in the line to slow the reader at the right moment, separated sentences that had tumbled together, and created lexica that tethered rare words to meanings. His students and colleagues learned to read with the ear as much as with the eye, to feel when the verse carried an extra foot like a stone in a shoe. On his desk lay a handful of tiny symbols, asterisks, diplei, obeloi, that could make a margin sing with information. A copyist in the next room, glancing over, could tell at once where a text bent toward error and where it stood firm. And then Aristarchus of Samothrace, the stern joy of precision. If Zenodotus had inaugurated the task on Homer, Aristarchus carried it to a zenith that intimidated the centuries. He gathered the best manuscripts he could find, weighed them line by line, and allowed no favouritism for a reading that merely pleased. He separated scholia, marginal notes, from the text proper, created signs to flag interpolations, and insisted the poems be treated not as sacred relics, but as literature with a history of transmission. Students learned the verbs that carried this discipline, diorthon to correct, ekdidonai to publish an edition, and found themselves reciting genealogies of variants like family trees. The result was not a single, incontrovertible Homer, but an achieved standard, a text that could underwrite education, criticism, and memory. Around these names clustered a world of quieter hands. Dozens of scribes learned to keep the line even when a papyrus seam approached. Collators marked places where the third copy departed from the first two, then brought their bundles to a room where a senior scholar waited with wax tablets and a practiced patience. Translators listened to Egyptian priests and bureaucrats explain records older than Greek, and then hunted for the Greek that could carry those records without breaking them. Binders glued edges, repaired tears, and trimmed new rolls so that a shelf looked like a sentence with a pleasing cadence. In one corner, a reader copied out rare words into a notebook, building a glossary that would be passed to a friend too sick to attend lectures that season. The Marcion's common table sustained this hive. Midday found a poet reaching for olives while a mathematician made a small sketch, and the physician across from them tested a line on his tongue to see if the vowels would stick in a fevered mouth. Conversation moved without shame between the trivial and the grand, the right way to cut a quill, the rumour of a new comedy found in a temple chest, whether the middle voice in a verb better caught the sense of a line about oars biting water, and whether last week's coastal wind had shifted earlier than usual. The muses were honoured with offerings on their altar, but their real worship was the unbroken chain of attention from one mind to the next. Politics ran beneath it all like a service conduit. The Ptolemies appointed the priest of the Marcion, funded stipends, and expected the glow of prestige to shine back upon the throne. Poets repaid with celebrations of dynastics' weddings and naval victories. Historians framed the kings within dignified genealogies that stretched to gods. Philosophers dedicated treatises with measured gratitude. Scholars understood the bargain and used it to enlarge their margins. Money bought time, time bought carefulness. Carefulness bought texts that could withstand more years than any single reign. Not every hour was serene. The same precision that made scholarship bloom could turn colleagues into rivals. Callimachus mocked the Telchines, grumblers who preferred long poems swollen with old pride. Apollonius answered with an epic tune to a modern ear. A quarrel over whether an accent belonged here or there could sour a friendship. A decision to prefer one manuscript family over another could offend a patron who funded the acquisition. But the library had room for irritation too. The marks in the margins record as many disagreements as agreements, and the city seemed to understand that a living institution must bruise and then heal in order to grow stronger. The training of students gave the work a future tense. A newcomer learned first to read the signs, the obelos to warn of spurious lines, the asterisk to note a repeated passage, the dipple to signal something worth attention, the chronis curling at the end of a book like a quiet flourish. He learned to hear the hexameter and to spot where a careless scribe had shifted a dactyl into a spondee. He learned that a variant was not a scandal but a clue, that words travelled like people and picked up colours en route. He learned that a catalogue could be a kind of poem, that the opening words of a book are a spell, and that the place where a scroll stands is itself a kind of sentence in the great paragraph of the library. Beyond Homer, other authors were brought under the same lamp. The tragedies were compared, catalogued, and staged with renewed respect for the original staging conventions. Lyric poets were edited for schools so that a boy in Alexandria could sing a poem first sung on an island hill. Historians were judged for bias and corrected for dates. Physicians' recipes were collated with a caution that could save a life. Mathematicians' propositions were copied with diagrams carefully redrawn, each line straight, each circle true. A book on mechanics whispered to an engineer designing a new crane for the harbour. A treatise on winds guided a ship's master across the open water. A commentary on Hesiod carried tucked in a quiet line of myth a farmer's proverb that a clerk used to set a fairer tax. The daughter library at the Serapeum, raised a little apart from the palace quarter, extended the reach of these habits. Overflow from the main collection found a dignified home there, within a temple that embodied the city's deliberate fusion of Egyptian and Greek. A scholar might pass between the two in the course of a day, carrying a scroll wrapped in a cloth, bowing to a priest before mounting the steps, then settling into a room where the air had the old, faint sweetness of papyrus and oil. The shelves did not compete, they conversed across distance. If you listen in one of the reading rooms late in the afternoon, you can hear the mouse-yon breathe, the small scrape of a reed against papyrus, the soft tap of a mark placed just so in the margin, the murmur of a line repeated aloud to test its rhythm, the brief clatter as a cabinet door closes and the label finds its angle again. A senior librarian, grey at the temples, lifts his eyes to the high windows, considering whether to leave the ambiguous word unresolved until a better manuscript comes from the islands in spring. A junior scholar copies a list of authors whose works are rumoured but not yet found, a wish as much as a ledger. A messenger enters with a roll from the harbour, salt still on the knot of the cord, and the room bends toward him like plants to light. The founders had imagined a place where learning could be treated as a public utility. What they built with the hands of many caretakers was a culture, a way of touching texts, of correcting one another without cruelty, of letting symbols in the margin carry the weight of a decade's thought, of hiring cooks and sweepers and porters so that philosophers might afford to be meticulous. The muses were not asked to descend in a blaze, they were invited to hover in the ordinary and to make the ordinary exact. And in that exactness, care ridden all the way to the smallest stroke of a pen, lived the quiet confidence that, whatever else a city might boast, a well-edited line can outlast stone. Before a text could travel, someone had to coax a plant into becoming a page. In the green labyrinths of the Nile marshes, harvesters waded among papyrus reeds, whose triangular stalks rose above their shoulders. The cutters chose stems thick and straight, the kind that split cleanly. Back in shaded courtyards, hands learned a patient rhythm. Slice the pale pith into long, thin strips. Lay one layer lengthwise on a wetted board. Cross it with another layer set at right angles. Press, drain, and leave to dry in the sun. When the sheet had set, a worker burnished it with a smooth shell or polished stone until the fibres felt like a single skin under the palm. A thin wash of gum, plant resin dissolved in water, tightened the surface. Held up to the light, you could see the hidden weave of the plant, one direction ready to receive ink, the other waiting quietly on the back. These sheets, called charts, were not yet a book. They were promised stacked in a pile. Joining, colesis, turned sheets into a roll. Artisans dabbed paste along one edge and overlapped the next sheet just so, always keeping the writing side, the one with upright fibres, on the inside of the curl. When the strip had become long enough, they trimmed the top and bottom edges to a neat line and fixed a slender wooden spindle to one end to help with winding. Some rolls wore little caps on their ends to keep them round and proud. Many travelled wrapped in linen and tied with a simple cord. If you rolled it out on a table, you would see the world arranged in narrow columns, each one a door the width of a hand's span, carefully ruled so that the text marched straight. The format protected the reader from fatigue. No column so wide that the eye had to hunt for the next line. No column so narrow that words were cramped like anxious birds. Scribes, grammates, prepared their tools with the ceremony of habit. A reed pen cut at an angle, split for a flexing nib. A little cake of carbon ink, soot mixed with water and gum that dried matte and indelible. A small pot for a thinner red ink used to highlight a title or a speaker's name. A sponge or cloth for the inevitable blot. They tested the nib on the margin until the lines sang the right thickness. Draft seldom touched fresh papyrus. Wax tablets served for trial runs, words scratched with a stylus that could be warmed and smoothed for reuse, or a broken potsherd, an ostracon took a quick note. Only when the wording settled did the fair copy begin. The reed nib whispering over the plant's grain like a boat across calm water. Writing arrived in columns without spaces between words, the letters marching in scriptio continua. The voice, sometimes the scribe's own, sometimes the ghost of the author, threaded punctuation into the music of the line. Early marks were gentle, a slight lift between sense units, a mid-dot placed like a breath. Later, scholars would add more, accents and breathings to guide pronunciation, a paragraphos, a little stroke in the margin, to announce a new section, a dipple, to flag a line worth extra attention, and in due time the neat architecture of commas and periods. But in the pure beginning, reading was a bodily art. You learned to hear the sentence with your eyes. Mistakes had names that sounded like characters in a cautionary tale. Homeoteleuton, the eye jumps from one line end into a similar one, and a chunk of text vanishes. Ditography, the scribe stutters on the page and writes a word twice. Eticism, the vowels, pronounced alike in everyday speech, wander into each other on the papyrus and swap places. Transposition, two letters trade seats. Haplography, a doubled consonant thins to one. Against these patient gremlins, Alexandria set equally patient habits. A diothotes, a corrector, followed the scribe, comparing the new roll against its exemplar. When doubt crept in, the roll moved to a room where 2 or 3 copies were laid side by side, while a scholar traced each line with a reed, meter tapping beneath his breath like a metronome for meaning. If a line stumbled, the margin received a small sign, a dot, a tiny spear, a note that said in effect, "Here is where the text needs an extra lantern." At the end of a roll, a scribe might add a colophon, the work's title, the author's name, perhaps the number of standard lines. Stikoi, copied, a discreet way to calculate pay and to check whether a future copyist's text had lost flesh. Sometimes the copyist slipped in a simple prayer, "Be gracious," or a weather note that turned the book human, finished on a hot day when the north wind failed. Rolls destined for heavy use often received generous margins, the better to hold scholia, marginal notes that grew, over generations, into a conversation braided around the core text. In Alexandria, those scholia might preserve a debate held under a portico 50 years earlier, or a conjecture on a corrupt word sharpened by a teacher's hand to a diamond point. Ink knew its own chemistry. Carbon black adhered well to papyrus and weathered centuries kindly. Red rubrication lifted headings, speaker names in dramas, or the opening line that served as a book's ID. If a correction was needed, papyrus did not invite scraping as parchment would later do. Instead, a thin knife could lift the top fiber's nap, or a wet sponge could soften and blur a stroke just enough for a new letter to take its place. More often, the correction lived beside the error, an honest scar in the margin. In Alexandria, error was less a shame than a datum, a clue to the path by which a text had travelled. Because rolls had bodies, they needed houses. The library kept them in wooden cupboards, armaria, with doors that latched against dust. Scrolls stood upright, their titles announced on little tags, "City Boy," attached to the ends so that a librarian could scan a shelf and feel each roll's identity like a pulse under a thumb. Cedar oil or other aromatics might be applied to deter insects and to give the stacks a clean, resinous breath. The rooms were high and dry, with windows that admitted indirect light. Papyrus liked shade. Sun was for harvest, not for the finished thought. Not all writing aimed for immortality. Merchants kept account rolls. Officials maintained registers. Priests copied liturgies whose cadence outlasted dynasties. Dockets, letters, contracts and receipts shared the same fibres as tragedies and treatises. In that proximity lived a certain democracy of ink. The same plant that carried a philosopher's argument also carried a potter's bill, and both might find themselves, centuries later, read with equal care by a scholar hungry for how people actually lived. The path from author to library shelf could be straight or as braided as a river delta. An author might dictate to a professional scribe, revise on wax until the temperature of the sentence felt right, then commission fair copies. Friends requested exemplars for their own libraries. Book dealers created market versions for sale in city stalls. Students made cheap transcripts with cramped hands and thin margins. The Alexandrian preference was to find the best witness the world could offer, something close to the author's own hand or a line of descent admired by other cities, and to let that witness anchor the others. From this practice emerged an early intuition of textual family trees. If two copies share a peculiar error, they are likely siblings descended from the same flawed parent. Reading habits shaped how books were built. A reader unrolled with the right hand and wound up with the left, keeping the column in the middle smooth and obedient. The roll rested on a table or across the lap, the left thumb sometimes marking a place by pressing a slight buckle into the papyrus. For long works, the copy might spread across multiple volumes, each with its own opening line noted on the tag to prevent confusion. A repertory reader learned the bodily memory of a text. Where the column with the famous simile fell, how many turns to a much-loved speech, the weight of the roll when the end was near. The physical distance travelled by the hands became a kind of semantic distance, and certain ideas came to live at certain places in the body's quiet choreography. The tools broadened as needs did. Rulers of twine, pulled taut and dusted with pigment, snapped straight guides onto the sheet. A small leaden plummet tested the alignment of columns. For diagrams in mathematics, a compass etched faint circles. For tables in astronomy or medicine, thin lines were drawn before the text went down, so numbers and names fell into their allotted cells. Some scribes cultivated a sloping, easy hand for letters. Others trained in a formal book script that stood upright and spare, every alpha alert, every mu disciplined against sprawling. In margins, explanatory glosses borrowed a quicker cursive, lighter and more conversational, so that the reader's eye could distinguish voice from commentary at a glance. Because the library believed in comparison, it believed in multiples. No text lived as a solitary monarch. A copy for the main reading room might be produced on finer grade papyrus, smooth and pale. Another for heavy classroom use might be sturdier, with thicker fibres that tolerated constant handling. When a promising new exemplar arrived, say a version of a play with a more persuasive chorus line, the library commissioned a fresh copy with those readings adopted and logged the changes in the working notes that trailed a text like a private history. In a small, well-used room, there might be a roll that carried nothing but variants, a scholar's quarry where future editors came to remember that every line had once been a crossroads. The world beyond papyrus whispered alternatives. In Pergamon, far to the north, parchment, sheep and goatskin took on writing with a creamy resilience that allowed scraping and rewriting, a palimpsest's second chance. A later legend tells of a papyrus embargo from Egypt that spurred parchment's rise. Legends grow where logistics do, but what matters is that bookmaking had more than one path. In Alexandria, papyrus remained the daily bread. Parchment appeared as a delicacy for smaller documents, deluxe copies, or when permanents asked for a tougher skin. Centuries on, a different form, the codex sheets folded and sewn along one edge, would begin to supplant the roll. But in the age of the Great Library, the scroll was still the mind's natural horizon. You moved through thought as you moved through space, with hands measuring how far you had come. Copying was work measured in hours and in attention. Payment could be by the stickos, the standard line, so many lines, so much coin, or by commission. A good scribe knew when to stop for the day. Tired eyes breed homoiota luton. In some rooms, 2 or 3 scribes copied from the same exemplar while a reader dictated, pronouncing each word slowly, then repeating when a quizzical glance rose from a desk. Dictation risked sound-alike errors. Copying by sight risked eye-skip. Collating afterwards forgave neither. A senior scholar's name at the end of a roll signalled that the text had been compared to the library's best, and approved for shelf life. Even the scent of books mattered. Fresh papyrus had a faint green sweetness. Older rolls breathed cedar and dust. A librarian could tell by smell when a stack needed attention, when a storeroom wanted more air, when a box had housed a roll too long. Alexandria's climate helped. Drier rooms, high windows, but insects and damp are relentless tutors. So rolls were rotated, inspected, retired. The library's memory did not depend on copying alone, it depended on care. And because books were also bodies in a crowd, they needed names that could be found. A small tag at the end of a roll carried the work's opening words, the incipit, its author, and sometimes the book number in a long series. The first line of a poem or treatise became its calling card, safer across generations than a title that might shift. Catalogue entries recorded those first words so that, when a scholar asked for the treatise beginning when the Etesian winds are slack, a porter could go directly to the shelf and return with the right weight of papyrus in his hands. In the quiet, after a day's copying, a roll rested under a board with a small weight placed just so to teach it good manners, to curl neither too tightly nor too loose. The room exhaled. A constellation of tools returned to their places. Somewhere a reed lay in a cup to soak, ready for tomorrow's sharpening. Somewhere a student, ink on his fingers, copied a few rare words from the margin into his little notebook, a personal lexicon that would make him quicker and kinder to future texts. And somewhere, perhaps in a room with higher windows and a view of a courtyard tree, a librarian read the opening of a book aloud, not because he didn't know it by heart, but because the human voice, braided with plant and ink and patient craft, was the last ingredient that turned a long ribbon of papyrus into a living book. They gathered a world by gathering its languages. Greek hummed in lecture halls and on tax receipts, the easy coin of merchants and scholars, but the shelves kept voices older than Greek and different in design. From the temple archives along the Nile came Egyptian texts in hieratic and demotic, land records, hymns to gods whose names tasted of stone and water, medical recipes that remembered the body as a river with channels to be cleared. Priests from the houses of life, those quiet temple libraries, sat with bilingual scribes and explained old words by gesture and example. This sign for a canal, this for a measure of barley, this for the pulse you feel at the wrist when the river is high. The scribe wrote a Greek equivalent in the margin, sometimes a whole phrase when a single word could not carry the weight. Over time, these marginal helps became glossaries, little lexica of strange words, glossae, that turned foreign wisdom into something an Alexandrian student could read without a priest at his elbow. From the east, data travelled as steadily as caravans. Babylonian astronomers had long kept notebooks that braided numbers with night. Now, under Seleucid skies, scholars wrote the old knowledge in Greek letters or summarised it for Greek ears. The library prized these imports. A table of lunar periods copied from a cuneiform source might arrive in a Greek hand, each column converted from base 60 to a counting that matched local habits. A note would explain that what the Babylonians called Nergal the Greeks called Aries, that a planet's zigzag across the sky could be predicted as a function of cycles within cycles. The conversion was never mere arithmetic. It demanded agreements about units, names and calendars, about how to make months meet when one culture counted by the moon and another by the sun, and the Egyptians, with their crisp 365-day civil year, refused to intercalate at all. On a table between two readers you could see the negotiation, a Babylonian number beside a Greek one, an Egyptian month name paired with its festival, a thin line showing where to lift a pen as the count passed a sacred day. Egypt itself taught this plural grammar in stone. Decrees were carved in multiple scripts so that a single law could walk through different literacies. When such trilingual stones were copied to papyrus for the palace files, a clerk might set the Greek, the Demotic, and a paraphrase one beneath another, a stairway for the eye. For historians and lexicographers, these alignments were treasure. They gave firm anchors for translating titles, offices, and the peculiar words of ritual. No guesswork, only a sentence that knew itself 3 ways at once. A generation later, when a scholar encountered a thorny Egyptian term in an older hymn. He could hunt its cousin in a decree and bring the right word across the bridge. Not every import was numbers and law. Stories crossed the water too, in the voice of travellers and in the careful Greek of local sages who wrote for a wider audience. An Egyptian priest named Manetho composed a history of the kings of the two lands in Greek for the Ptolemaic court, laying out dynasties as if they were shelves in a well-run library. A Babylonian priest named Brossus wrote the myths and histories of his own people in Greek on the island of Kos, and summaries of that work wandered back to Egypt, where historians excerpted them like spices into larger stews. None of these texts travelled unaltered. They changed key as they changed language. But the library kept both the old note and the new chord whenever it could, so that later readers could hear the transposition and judge its honesty. Among the largest acts of translation was a work born from the needs of a community rather than the demands of a king. In Alexandria lived a great number of Jews, their prayers fluent in Hebrew and Aramaic, their daily business conducted in Greek. To hear scripture in the language of the home and the market, translators turned the Torah into Greek, the version that came to be called the Septuagint. Tradition gilded the story. 72 elders, working separately, produced identical renderings as if guided hand to hand. The tale honours the text more than it records logistics. The real wonder was method. Phrases that in Hebrew compacted meaning into a single root often required a spread of Greek words that had to be chosen with care. Divine names posed a special question, whether to transliterate, to translate as Lord, or to leave a respectful blank that later hands would fill. Where a ritual term had no Greek twin, the translators left the Hebrew sound wearing a Greek coat. Where moral law met Greek philosophy, they found words that could mingle at a dinner table without losing their shape. Copyists in the library marked unusual choices in the margin so that future readers would understand why a well-known Greek word looks slightly strange in the mouth of Moses. Genres touched each other like neighbours across a thin wall. Shelves of drama, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides and the newer poets, stood beside shelves of medical recipes and prognostics. A physician could lift a play to learn how an old audience heard a disease named, and a dramatist could borrow a healer's metaphor to harden a speech. Lyric anthologies sat near botanical treatises. The word for the colour of a leaf carried its tinge more precisely, when a botanist had pressed the leaf itself between papyrus sheets in a notebook and written the hue in the margin. Historians borrowed dates from astronomers who had pinned eclipses to particular regnal years. Geographers leaned on sailors' periploi, coast-sailing manuals listing ports, currents, anchorages, and cape-to-cape distances, then corrected them with reports from pilots who had fought a new shoal or found a quieter cove in an unexpected wind. A legal code was shelved not far from a manual for irrigation. Both taught a reader how water should move and what happens when it does not. The scholars made tools for crossing. Glossaries matched rare words to plainer ones. Commentaries braided together long lines of explanation so that a student could read Homer with a chorus of learned voices at his side. Epitomes condensed sprawling histories into books you could carry from lecture hall to harbour without a porter. Anthologies, chrestomachais, collected useful passages, a page of metaphors for a poet, a page of legal formulas for a novice scribe, a page of proverbs for anyone who wished to sound as if he had lived longer than he had. On a desktop you might see a stack that looked like this: the main roll, a commentary roll, a slim epitome to catch the gist, and a notebook where a reader was building his own private map of meanings, the way one paints the borders on a blank chart after sailing a coastline. Some translations required more than words. They needed diagrams to survive the crossing. Mathematical works pinned their truth to figures. A proposition that breathed in one language suffocated in another unless the circle and the chord were drawn again with the compass's sharp point. In medicine, a scribe copying an anatomical description from an older Egyptian text would lay fine lines in the margin to suggest position and path, a nerve along the inner arm, a duct from the eye. Engineers' treatises on levers and screws travelled with little sketches that made the sentence honest. The library learned to store texts and images together, sometimes stitching a small illustrated slip into a roll at the right place, or copying a diagram directly onto the papyrus between columns, careful that the glue seam did not run through the centre of a circle. Music crossed in notation and in numbers. A treatise on scales and modes might carry snatches of melody pricked into the margin, the letters standing for notes and the rhythm inferred by a student trained to clap patterns with a tutor. When the text mentioned a foreign scale, an Egyptian flavour, a Lydian tint, the commentator added a brief description of intervals for readers who had ears trained otherwise. Poets raided these pages to find metaphors that had not yet been dulled by overuse. Musicians raided the poets for words that felt like sound. Agronomy and natural history tied learning to lunch. Manuals described when to prune vines under Egyptian skies and how to read the Nile flood on the leaves of willow and fig. A Greek reader, newly arrived and eager to act like a local, could learn which canal to open first after a lean inundation, and how to shore a field when the river was generous to the point of danger. Alongside these practical counsels lived marvels recorded by travellers, a fish that swam up a desert river once every many years, birds that nested on floating islands of reeds and mud. A later reader would mark such passages with a small forked sign, "Ask again," so that the next traveller who returned from that district knew exactly which claim to test. Religion and philosophy braided in similarly pragmatic ways. Hymns to Egyptian gods, translated into Greek, taught Greek readers how to stand in a temple and what to say without offence. Philosophers reading those hymns found metaphysical questions where a priest had been content with praise. If a god is both one and many, how does unity relate to image? Priests reading philosophy found plausible language to explain an old rite to a new ruler. In the margin of a hymn, a commentator might write, "As the philosophers say," and in the margin of a philosophical treatise, another might note, "As the priests do," allowing two vocabularies to shake hands without either being forced to change clothes. Commerce brought its own library. Contracts, ship charters, court records, and tax rules provide a grammar of necessity. When a Seleucid clause appeared in a merchant's copybook, the Alexandrian clerk translated it into the Ptolemaic idiom and added a brief note. In Syria they count interest by the lunar month. Here, by the civil month. Beware the difference in a leap of days. A tariff list pinned to a customs office wall became in time a tidy roll with headings and cross-references so that a new official could find the rate for dyed wool as quickly as for pepper. These low genres hardly ever made the Pinakes glow with fame, but they taught students how cultures actually calibrated value, trust, and time. Language meetings happened at the level of letters too. A grammarian teaching the Greek of tragedy to boys who spoke the Greek of the marketplace used glossaries of Atticisms, rare forms explained with common ones. He also kept a list of Egyptian names transliterated into Greek, so his students would not fear a cluster of consonants at the start of a line. When he encountered a Hebrew proper name in the Greek scriptures, he marked its syllables for stress and made a note about sound that cannot be carried perfectly across. He taught that transliteration is not failure. It is a confession that a name has its own dignity. Behind all this lay classification. The library did not shelve languages apart, but nested them by subject whenever possible. A student working on astronomy could pull Greek treatises that descended from Eudoxus and Hipparchic tables that smelled of the East, a scroll of Egyptian star lore, a commentary that harmonized them, and a sailor's calendar that linked star risings to winds and currents. In medicine, a cabinet might hold Hippocratic texts, Alexandrian anatomical notes, an Egyptian pharmacopoeia written in a practicum tone, and a glossed list of plant names giving the Greek, the Egyptian, and a description vivid enough to forestall lethal confusion. The Pinakes recorded these proximities. In the catalogue entry for a book on fevers, Callimachus's brief biography of the author sat beside a note. Cf. the treatise beginning When the Days Shorten. In the cabinet on dietetics, and a cautious warning that 2 books of similar title were not by the same hand. The catalogue did more than locate, it connected. Even fable and wisdom travelled on this road. Short animal stories, the kind later gathered under the name of Aesop, wandered from oral tradition into slender roles, their morals adapted for urban life. A fox might learn the new lesson that a courtier's banquet has better leftovers than a shepherd's bag. Eastern wisdom sayings arrived with traders and were clipped into Greek like slips grafted onto a fruit tree. In a schoolroom, a teacher set such a saying as a copy exercise, and a boy learned pen control while copying a sentence that would be useful when he was 40. When a new text entered the city, the welcome was practical. A porter brought the roll to an intake desk. A clerk recorded the author as given, the opening words, the dialect if known, and any previous owner of note. A scholar skimmed to see whether it belonged with history or geography, or whether it hid a mathematical appendix that would move it to a more technical cabinet. If a translation was needed, a small team formed. One fluent in the source language, one well read in the target genre, one with a feel for where a sentence can flex and where it must not. Their aim was not to make the foreign Greek, but to make Greek hospitable enough that the foreign could be heard. In the evening light of a reading room, you could watch the traffic of genres as if it were ships in the inner harbour. A poet set aside a hymn to consult a botanical list for the exact name of the leaf that shines like oil after rain. A geographer put down a periplus to pick up a myth that explained why a headland was called the Bride's Gate. A jurist left a court precedent to open a philosophical treatise on justice, and made a note of a sentence that might persuade a hesitant judge. What the city stored was not merely books, but habits of crossing. From language to language, from craft to craft, from story to number and back again. In those crossings, differences were not dissolved. They were understood, labelled, and kept accessible so that tomorrow's reader could begin where today's left off. At first light, the colonnades hold a coolness like a kept promise. A porter sweeps the peristyle with a palm broom, making gentle ovals in the dust. The scent of damp stone rises where last night's dew lingers in the grout between paving slabs. Beyond the courtyard, a fig tree ticks with waking birds, and somewhere a kitchen ladle taps the lip of a bronze pot as breakfast porridge thickens. Gates open without hurry. The steward of the Mousillon checks a slate of names, nods to the baker delivering loaves, and lifts the latch for a scholar returning from the docks with salt on his hem and a new rumour of a manuscript in a trader's chest. Residents come downstairs with reed pens tucked behind ears, with wax tablets under arms, with sleep still folded into their hair. They cross the ambulatory where the muses have altars, each one garlanded in yesterday's green. A priest's apprentice adjusts the wreath on Calliope and replaces a spent oil wick before the day grows bright enough that flame is unnecessary. No one speaks loudly. The first words belong to the pages. The working day begins with division by temperament. The mathematicians gather under the eastern portico to borrow the morning's long angle of light. A teacher draws a circle with a compass on a smoothed plank, and apprentices learn the steady pressure that keeps the point from chewing raggedly through the grain. Across the courtyard, a grammarian opens a roll of Homer and traces the first hexameter with a fingernail, counting quietly as the rhythm steps into place. In the apothecary garden behind the dining hall, a physician stoops among fennel and rue, checking the night's growth and pinching a leaf to confirm a scent, before lecturing on simples and compound remedies. A geographer returns a flat basket of pebbles to the teaching shelf. Each stone is labelled for a coastline, chalk for the western cliffs, red limestone for a desert bay, basalt for the volcanic islands, because the hand remembers what the eye forgets. Stipends make the air feel thick with possibility. Rooms are small but dignified. A pallet, a low chest, a lamp, a shelf for personal rolls. No one here hunts for dinner unless the argument demands it. The common table is set at the 5th hour. Bread, olives, cheese, greens, sometimes fish, always water and thin wine. And before that bell, minds graze on their subjects with a focus that would starve in a world where the next meal is uncertain. A copyist paid by the line nods to a philosopher fed by the king. Both know the economy that sustains their precision. The Mausion rehearses a choreography of movement that looks accidental to a visitor and inevitable to those who live inside it. The peripatos, long-roofed walk, collects the walkers who think better in motion. Two astronomers pace side by side, trading numbers and night's news. A faint comet in the northern sky. A suspicion that the period of a planet's retrograde has been miscounted by 3 days in the old table. A poet falls into step with them to borrow a phrase. Retrograde is a hard word to warm, but the image of a wandering god stepping backward through the firmament will suit a hymn. At the far end of the walk, an engineer locks a small wooden box that holds his model, screws and levers. No one minds if a curiosity passes from hand to hand, but the box has a way of migrating to the nearest bench whenever a puzzle gathers a crowd, and projects need endings as much as beginnings. Lecture rooms breathe the sea through high windows. Benches worn to a satin by generations of elbows accept new forearms with a sense of continuity. When the steward strikes the bronze disc with a staff, the first set of lessons begins. In one room, a librarian shows how to read the signs in the margin. The little spear that says, "Beware this verse," the asterisk that says this line, repeats elsewhere. Compare. The curl of the coroners that draws a book to a gentle close. He unrolls 3 copies of a tragedy side by side, and lets silence do part of the teaching. Students find the differences with their eyes before they speak them aloud. In another room, a physician names the bones of the wrist in a calm voice, and then puts down the roll to show an apprentice how to bind a sprain so the fibres of the cloth align with the body's own logic. A boy in the 3rd row, who thinks himself a future poet, realizes with a small shock that he is learning meter from the way the bandage wraps. Between sessions, the dining hall sets out bowls of figs and pitchers of water. The custom is to eat facing inward, to keep the conversation in the circle. A navigator on leave from the fleet sits beside a lexicographer. They argue about the right name for the wind that comes after the Etesians fail. He calls it by a sailor's oath. The lexicographer insists on a term from a poet no one has staged in a century. A third voice proposes an Egyptian name that tastes of silt and reed. They agree to differ and to annotate, promising a commentator's footnote that will give a reader 3 doors instead of 1. At the end of the bench, a man from Serene passes around a small notched stick and explains his method for counting the length of a street without stretching a rope. A boy tests the notch spacing with his thumbnail and files the trick in the drawer where he keeps the better ways of doing simple things. The campus listens to the lighthouse even when it is not visible. At noon, when the sun sits heavy, a shadow line crosses the courtyard's central dial and fixes the day in the memory of the stone. A teacher uses the moment to speak of equal hours and of seasonal ones, of how the Romans count and why the Egyptians refuse to adjust their civil year, of what a calendar does to grain rations and court dates when it drifts. A clerk takes this talk back to his office and, before the heat dissolves his resolve, edits a rubric in the tax manual so that a harried official in a provincial town will not misdate a levy on account of a drifting feast. Afternoons belong to collation and craft. Scribes sitting at tall tables copy by sight, their eyes moving like swallows between exemplar and new papyrus. A reader in the corner dictates from a mathematical treatise, his voice marked by a cadence that keeps figures distinct from words. From point A, draw, to point B. Pause. The angle, pause, is equal to. The room absorbs the rhythm and the rule at once. In the herbarium, a team presses plants between sheets of discarded papyrus and thin wood, then hangs the bundles to dry. The specimens will travel with a roll as companions to argument. Down a corridor, a music master pricks a fragment of melody above a line of text with a stylus and a group of students tries the phrase softly to test whether the words sit naturally on the notes or whether a verb must be shortened to keep the song from tripping. The Mousillon holds rooms for careful noise. In the shop where reed pens are cut, the rasp of a knife across a stalk has a satisfying regularity. Cut, test, trim, test, burnish, test, until the nib catches the ink and releases it with a line that neither starves nor floods. In the instrument room, a steward unlocks the cabinet that houses armillary rings, astrolabes, and an awkward cluster of tubes used to sight elevations. Each tool has a linen sleeve with a scribbled instruction. Wipe salt. Do not oil here. Check pin. Nearby, a chest of weights and measures carries two systems side by side, with a small chart tucked under the lid to translate quickly between river trade and sea trade, between civic standard and temple measure. The chart is greasy with years of fingers. The knowledge it holds is not glamorous, but it prevents arguments that waste afternoons. A day like this generates paper trails that look like literature to anyone with patience. A small boys' school attached to the complex sends over copy exercises, 2 lines of Hesiod followed by 2 lines of a civic oath, which the grammarian reviews and returns with mild rebuke, and sometimes a rare praise. The hand steadied, breathing marks good, do not fear the long vowel. A visiting rhetorician leaves a sheet of topics for tomorrow's demonstration. Whether the city should fund a second lighthouse at the western mouth, whether a benefactor may rename a public fountain, whether a father may compel a son to study medicine when the son declares himself a poet. The steward posts the list on the courtyard wall. The bakers read it while kneading dough and take bets on which side will win the loudest clapping. At the common meal, the tables are long and voices mix disciplines without regard for prestige. A surgeon argues kindly with a philosopher about whether the seat of courage sits in the chest or the belly. The philosopher concedes that fear lives wherever breath shortens, and asks the surgeon, in return, not to reduce metaphors to flesh too quickly. A librarian passes around a sliver of papyrus with 2 spellings of a god's name and asks for votes. The room gives him opinions and jokes and 2 scraps of evidence, and he goes away smiling because he has collected every reason he needs to prefer the plainer form in the next edition. Someone recites a brief new poem at the end of the meal, and someone else groans theatrically, and the poet takes the groan with grace and revises the 3rd line in his head on the walk to the wine jar. Evening lessons, after the heat, draw out the city's practical mind. Mariners show boys how to tie knots that remember their purpose. A mason, borrowed from a royal project, explains why one aligns a doorway to the prevailing breeze and how to scribe a true right angle with nothing but a cord and 3 fingers. A midwife, bolder than the rule allows, is invited to describe how she judges a labour that will need more hands. She speaks plainly, and the physician who presides listens without correcting and writes 2 new lines into his lecture for the morning. In the menagerie beyond the wall, small, carefully kept, more study than spectacle, a keeper turns a water wheel by hand to teach how a screw lifts water from a low basin to a high trough, and a child stares as if watching fire for the first time. The discipline that protects this world is simple and strict. Tools return to their shelves with the handles facing out. Rolls are tied with their cords coiled, not knotted. Lamps are trimmed on a tray, and never above open papyrus. Voices lower themselves when someone reads aloud. Disagreement is required to be exact. A student who says, "This line is wrong," must say wrong how, and the better courtesy is to say corrupt, which blames no one living. When tempers rise, because they do in any place that houses love, the priest of the Muses invites both parties to walk the peripatos and talk while moving. Most storms break by the western gate. Visitors ripple the surface without breaking it. An ambassador arrives with a gift, a roll said to come from the island where the poet Sappho sang. The librarian accepts it with a smile that is not credulity, copies the opening words onto a card for the intake ledger, and sets the roll aside to be tested tomorrow against a list of first lines, hand, ink, dialect. A merchant from Tyre brings a recipe for purple dye that he swears is new. The dye master laughs in good humour, shows the page for the oldest recipe, nearly identical, but buys the man a cup for the trouble of remembering. A philosopher from the Stoa in Athens speaks for an hour about self-sufficiency. A quiet boy walks him afterward to the harbour and shows him how the city counts its ships, so grain does not run short in winter, and neither man thinks the other foolish. When night comes, the lighthouse on Pharos throws its slow piston of light. In the library rooms, shutters sit half-closed to keep the draught from flipping a column too quickly. Those who love the night's circle of quiet unroll their tasks again. A grammarian recalibrates accents that drifted in the afternoon. A young woman in the herb room writes in her notebook the patient's fever chart as a poem, so she can remember it without the lamp tomorrow when she has no hands free to hold a roll. The steward counts oil flasks and draws a line on each, a small horizon to guard against careless extravagance. Down the corridor, the men in the penroom sharpen reeds in a kind of liturgy. One hums a hymn under his breath, tapping his foot in an anapest. Sleep finds people in sensible places. Some fall asleep over a table with their head pillowed on a forearm. Some climb to the roof and lie on their backs to let the day drain out of their bones, while the constellations take attendance. Some stay awake for the hour when the city is most teachable, when a problem yields because the room is not watching, when a line of verse accepts its last word quietly, when a student who never spoke speaks, and a teacher for once says, "I don't know," and the room breathes relief together. What makes the Museion feel like a city inside a city is not just that it has kitchens and gardens, workshops and rules. It is that time itself keeps a different generosity here. The hours are fed like animals, regularly with patience, and in return the animals become tame. A thought that would have skittered away in a busy market lets itself be touched. A method that once shouted its existence from a battlefield whispers from the margin with a tiny sign, and, because everyone here has learned the language of small signs, is heard. On some nights, rain finds Alexandria and the roof tiles rattle like shells. The next morning the courtyards smell rinsed. The parapetos shines. A boy in sandals squeaks as he runs. The librarian takes a roll from a shelf and finds a drop that made a small star on the tag. He dries it carefully, notes the moment in the ledger, and moves the shelf away from the draft. It is a small correction to the building's habits, and the building, like a good student, remembers. In that remembering, in those 1,000 adjustments made without fuss so that reading can go on, the place keeps its vow, to be a sanctuary for work that will outlast the hands that do it. In a quiet room off the eastern peristyle, tables stand at a comfortable height, the sort that invite a long afternoon without punishing the back. On one table lies a stack of slim rolls, each wrapped in linen and tied with the same careful knot. The first is untied and spread to the width of 2 hands. At the top, in a clean, upright book script, is written a single word that explains the room. Pinax, a tablet, a list, a map. The hand belongs to Callimachus, who believed that to navigate a sea of books one must chart its currents, its shoals, its hidden harbours, and the lights by which a reader can find them. He begins not with a heap, but with families. Poetry, drama, history, medicine, mathematics, philosophy, technical arts, rhetoric, miscellanies. Each great province receives its own series of roles. Within a province, authors stand in single file by the alphabet, each name followed by a short life, the way a guide points at a house and mentions who built it, who lives there now, who keeps better wine than he admits. After the name, a list of works appears. Full titles where tradition has them, opening lines where titles shift or lie, the number of books in long works, the total of standard lines, a stoichiometric note that lets a librarian measure loss or theft by arithmetic instead of sorrow. Where a text is falsely attributed, Callimachus puts his small, unsentimental mark, not by this author. Where 2 books share a name, He writes the first words for each so a clerk will not bring the wrong one with a smile that cost everyone a morning. The entries do more than describe. They locate. A small code, cabinet, shelf, cubby, sends a porter exactly where he needs to go. Medicine, cabinet 6, third cubby. Tragedy, cabinet 2, top row, 5th slot. A student copying yesterday's lecture on fevers can ask for the book beginning When the Days Shorten in dietetics, and the catalogue will answer without the student knowing the author's full name. The same system rescues the harried teacher who remembers only that a needed passage began with a remark about tea and winds and barley. The incipit is the key that opens a door even when the door's inscription has faded. Because knowledge grows by paths rather than by piles, cross-references lace the margins. Compare the treatise in mechanics that begins. See also the commentary on the same passage under the author's name. Do not confuse with the book, On Seeds, by the other man of the same name. A reader moving through the Pnyx feels the tug of a thread he didn't know he held. The catalogue is not an inventory. It is a set of invitations, but a map must be honest about fog. Callimachus preserves doubts with the same neatness he grants facts. Some say there are 13 books, others 14. Opening line reported differently by Rhodes. Title uncertain, known by its first word in this city. A future librarian reading these notes knows where to add courage and where to add patience. A future student learns, early, that scholarship is not a march so much as a dance with a partner who sometimes steps away. On another table, an assistant copies a shorter, handier digest, the sort of roll a teacher can carry to the lecture hall without a porter. It lists only authors and works, stripped of biography, rich in location. Callimachus does not despise such abridgment. He writes epitomes with the understanding that a mind often needs a narrow path before it can love a wide field. Behind him, a clerk warms wax to mend a cracked rod that holds a catalogue roll. Tools and categories sit happily side by side. Students are trained to read the Pnyx as they would read a poem. The first lesson is not to skip the small print. Look, a librarian says, tapping the slighter letters after a famous name. This note tells you the copy here differs from the copy in Pergamon by 70 lines. If your argument depends on the longer version, say so. If you prefer the shorter because the metre breathes more naturally, say that instead. The catalogue will remember your preference, the shelf will not. The second lesson is humility. A boy finds that the orator he admires wrote 3 works of which he has never heard. He blushes in the way the body does when the mind grows. The third lesson is mercy for the dead. When the Pnyx marks a book spurious, it does not exile it from the shelves. It shelves it honestly, in the section for works that travel under borrowed names. A clever passage can be useful even if it was carried by the wrong voice to the door. A day's work with the Pnyx ends in movement. A scholar fills a request slip, author, opening line, code, and hands it to a porter who vanishes between cabinets. There is pleasure in watching him go. He turns left where anyone else would turn right, reaches up for a cubby without looking, counts with his fingers along the row, and returns with a roll that looks to the uninitiated like any other roll, but to the initiated like the exact weight of an answer. When the book is returned, the slip receives a dot, not tracking a reader, but tracking a life. Books that are loved deserve more copying, books that are ignored deserve a second chance under a new teacher. The catalogue becomes a pulse chart for the city's attention. Over time, the Pnyx changes the shape of conversation. When someone says the historians, no one imagines a shapeless crowd. They see a ranked file with names, opening lines and arguments about authenticity. When someone says bring me the poets, the question that follows is which shelf? Elegy, iambic, lyric, epic, each with a list of faces, an order of approach, a promise that if you begin here, you can reach there. The library begins to feel not vast but navigable, not random but scored, like a piece of music whose key you can trust even when the melody surprises you. And because every map teaches a traveller to draw, the Pnyx breeds children. A teacher compiles a local catalogue of texts used in his school, with the Phoenix codes adapted to his room's cupboards. A physician makes a small index of plant names, triple-columned, Greek, Egyptian, description, and tucks it into the flap of his favourite pharmacology roll. A lexicographer builds a list of rare words encountered in comedy, each entry tagged with "see also" pointers learned from Callimachus's practice. Even the palace adopts the method. The storeroom's inventory lists acquire opening descriptions, cross-references, and warnings against confusion between two similar jars of dye. All this order would mean little if the shelves were bare. In the harbour beyond the royal quarter, sails bloom like white flowers at every hour of day. The acquisition room smells of cedar and salt, and it is always busy. A clerk at the intake table records a ship's name, the captain's city, the cargo of objects, and, with a glance that seems casual and is not, the presence of books. The city's rule is brisk and unapologetic. Any books that enter Alexandria must be surrendered for copying. A runner hurries them inland with the same urgency one gives to a fever. The promise is prompt return, and it is kept, though not in the way a captain expects. On a long bench, a team divides labour as if cutting a river into channels. One reads aloud from the ship's book, steady and slow, pausing at numbers, repeating titles, spelling names that might drift in the air. Two scribes copy to fresh papyrus, trained to hear the difference between a long vowel and a short even when the heat blurs speech. A diorthotes stands ready to check a column against the exemplar, marking a doubtful line with a small dot rather than a hiss. If the text is technical, astronomy, mechanics, medicine, an appropriate specialist is summoned from the next building with a hand still inked from his own work. He stands over the copyist and says quietly, "No, that figure must be drawn wider," or "That plant name cannot be right. You've written the marsh iris when the dose belongs to the mountain gentian." By evening the copies are complete, wrapped, and returned to the harbour with a courteous note. In good faith, the city has preserved your text and returns to you a clean copy. The captain is pleased until he notices later a small label on the library's version. From the ships. The rumour is not wrong. Alexandria often keeps the original and returns the copy. The justification is practical and priestly. The best witness belongs where it can be compared and preserved for all. A merchant may fume in his cabin. A scholar in a lit room across town murmurs thanks to a policy that saves centuries. Royal agents work farther afield, armed with letters, purses, and charm. Athens and Rhodes know their faces the way markets know familiar buyers. They visit bookstalls that smell of leather and dust, run fingers over the first lines of rolls to see if the ink still rises proud from the papyrus, ask after a philosopher's papers that an ungrateful nephew might be willing to sell. They haunt sanctuaries whose archives are more orderly than a palace's, where treaties and tragedies sleep in air that never hurries. Sometimes they borrow with deposits so large they make a city's treasurer feel admired. Sometimes they return copies and forfeit the deposit with a wince and a shrug, calculating that the original in Alexandria is worth any coin now counted as loss. Not all acquisitions are intentional. A fisherman sells a bundle of odds and ends pulled from a ship's broken chest. Inside lies a small roll with a few songs in a dialect that sings like wind through olives. A schoolmaster dies and his widow brings a basket of teaching rolls to the palace gate. The steward buys them all, not because they are rare, but because they are worn exactly where a city wears its learning, and that is a record worthy of shelves. A traveller from Syria arrives with a book of riddles. A grammarian reads them, laughs once, then keeps 3 because they hide rare words like seeds in a pomegranate. Fraud has its own office. A forger improves a mediocre scroll by adding a famous name to the tag. The intake clerk notes that the hand is newer than the claim, the dialect unsuited to the supposed author, the stichometry wrong by a suspicious margin. An investigator takes 3 afternoons and returns with a small report. The roll is valuable, but not for the name it pretends to wear. It is shelved honestly and catalogued accordingly, so that a future reader will not waste rage on a forgery but will find use in what is true. Egyptian temples give more than offerings to the muses. They give documents that turn policy into patience. The House of Life at a major shrine yields tax registers, land surveys, and manuals for floodgates written in Demotic, brought across into Greek by translators who know both the land and the words. When such documents arrive, the library assigns an interdisciplinary welcome, a scribe for the copying, a jurist for the meaning, a geographer for the map that hides inside the numbers. The result is not a merely translated text, but an adapted one. Greek words that do not erase Egyptian measures, notes that explain a festival day to a clerk who counts by a different calendar, tables that reconcile the river's rise to the civil year without forcing either to apologise for being itself. Grander gifts cross the threshold too. A courtier donates a poet's notebook found among the ashes of a burnt house. The pages carry drafts, false starts, a list of metaphors he meant to try one winter. A philosopher's pupil surrenders lecture notes, rough and private, relying on the library's vow to keep secrets long enough to make them useful and not so long that they suffocate. A physician brings a box of small tablets from a country clinic, fevers charted in lines that tremble, recipes that substitute local herbs for exotic ones when the river keeps ships away. These are not great works, but they are great witnesses, and the Pnyx learns to make room for them under headings that did not exist before. There is a day each month set aside for reconciliation, when acquisition meets catalogue face to face. Intake logs are copied into the Pnyx, cross-references are added, trial placements are tested. A role that sat uncertainly among miscellanies finds a truer home among agronomy. A text long thought to be a standalone is recognised as a missing book in a set, its first line catching hands like two halves of a broken coin. The catalogue grows thicker without growing confused because each new branch is grafted with care. Where a category begins to swell beyond use, medicine subdivided into dietetics, surgery, pharmacology, the headings change and the shelf labels with them. The librarians do not announce revolutions. They move a roll, and in moving it, alter the city's way of finding. The policy of abundance has consequences that the library accepts like a strong swimmer accepts a current. More books mean more errors caught, more variants discovered, more evenings where 3 readings compete without malice at the same table, until one earns the right to stand first in the line. It also means greater maintenance, more cedar oil for cupboards, more cord for ties, more copyists trained not only to write, but to write exactly. The steward orders reeds in bundles, ink in bricks, papyrus in tall rolls that boys carry 2 at a time with the pride of porters who know they are moving thought. On a late afternoon when the harbour wind moves briskly, a runner arrives with a small, tightly wrapped roll stamped with a city seal. It is an official copy of a decree in 3 scripts. The intake clerk calls for a translator, the translator calls for a lexicographer, the lexicographer calls for a historian who knows why this law matters, and all 4 stand around the table while a scribe takes down a version that will sit beside the original. A note in the margin reads, "This phrasing helps the Greek understand what the Demotic assumes," and another reads, "Keep the divine names as they are." When the copy is done, the original is returned with a letter of thanks and a polite promise to share any corrections should a more accurate version appear. The ships go out on the evening tide. The promise goes out with them. By night the acquisition room grows quiet and the Pnyx room grows bright. Candles throw a honey light onto the clean columns of names. Someone adds a dot beside a book that travelled twice in a single week. Someone draws a line from a plant treatise to a new commentary on charms, because a physician has found that words can matter to healing even when they move no muscles. In the harbour, the lighthouse turns, steady as a pulse. In the library, the catalogue turns too, invisible but just as steady, and the 2 lights together hold the city to its course. Bring everything you can within reach, and make it findable for those not yet born. Morning lays a geometric calm across the courtyards, as if the sun were drawing proofs in light. A tall gnomon stands in the gravel, its shadow a crisp needle that glides, minute by minute, across a tiled meridian line set into the earth. Students arrive with wax tablets and plumb lines on cords. A teacher sets a simple problem on the day itself. Measure the shadow now, note the height of the rod, and let the ratio speak. Angles and time converse without words. The more they practice, the more the sky feels like a book that can be read if you keep your place. In one room, Euclid's pages lie open like quiet laws. A senior scholar traces the outline of a triangle on a scraped smooth board and begins from the beginning. Definitions, common notions, postulates, each spoken in a tone that invites assent rather than demands it. A line is breadthless length. Things equal to the same thing are equal to one another. The postulate that a straight line can be drawn from any point to any point is received like an old friend. The proof proceeds with a grace that hides the labour of centuries. Constructions with a compass that pricks the wood, circles that exist because the hand insists they do. Parallels that hold their distance not from habit but from necessity. On the back bench, a boy, who thought numbers were only for adding figs, feels something inside his chest straighten quietly, the way a spine rightens after a long day's bend. Geometry feeds the city's hands as much as its minds. Down by the waterworks, engineers chalk triangles on the wall to measure a channel without draining it. A mason uses a cord knotted to 3, 4 and 5 units to conjure a right angle from air. A surveyor, sent upriver to plot a new canal, returns with a map whose rectangles look like a hymn to reason. He lays it beside a roll of Euclid and smiles as if he has overheard 2 old men agree on something practical. At midday, when the gnomon's shadow shrinks toward honesty, a group gathers around a long bench for an exercise that has become a local rite. 2 cities, 2 wells, and the courage to trust a number, Sienne, where the sun at the solstice goes straight down a deep shaft and lights the water, Alexandria, where at the same hour the gnomon keeps a measurable shadow. Mark the angle here at noon. Measure the distance between cities by caravan rhythm. Days converted to stades with the realism of men who have walked them. Then let a circle reveal itself when a fraction of its sweep and accord are known. The earth's size emerges not from magic but from patience. An answer stable enough to guide a long ship's winter provisioning and audacious enough to make people laugh softly the first time they believe it. Someone writes the number and the method in a precise hand, because the method is the more valuable of the two. Maps acquire a new humility under such hands. A geographer pins latitude with confidence and learns to treat longitude as a promise, something to be approached with stages of approximation, better winds, and a generation's work. He draws lines across a parchment that looks like a naked fruit peeled of coastline superstition, then adds rivers, mountains, caravan miles, and sailing days in inks of different shades. On the rightmost margin a small note sits like a lantern. Here rumours outrun soundings. Pilots like that kind of honesty. At night, astronomers climb a stair toward instruments that are patient with darkness. A bronze armillary ring, polished to a soft glow, carries the equator, the ecliptic, and the observer's local circles. A sighting tube finds a star and kisses it to an angle. They keep tables of risings and settings, trace the slow backward drift of certain points among constellations, and compare their numbers with Babylonian lists written in an unfamiliar hand that still counts with the same cosmos. A water clock drips in the corner, each drop an argument against forgetting. When the observers think they have found a planet's period, they do not write it once. They braid it with earlier records, then write how they found it so that another can modestly doubt them later. Conversation makes daring ideas possible without making the room dangerous. A quiet mathematician suggests that the sun sits still while the earth moves, as if the world were a bold pupil who has switched seats without asking permission. He proposes it in a tone that honours both the audacity and the limits of what observations can bear. Some wince, some smile, Most reach for their tablets to write down the reasoning in case future refinements of instrument and method tilt the balance. Even when the city returns for practical calculations to models that keep the Earth calm at the centre and let the planet dance in circles, the seed remains in a margin, a possibility shelved, not burned. Mechanics has its own hymns. In the yard behind a lecture hall stands a wooden beam balanced on a fulcrum no wider than a thumb. A teacher asks a student to lift a heavy stone with his bare hands. He fails with laughter. They slide the fulcrum, add a long arm on one side, and the same boy lifts the stone while a crowd shouts at the way intelligence turns muscle into grace. In a basin nearby, a curious crown goes under water while a scribe marks how the level rises in a thin-necked jar. A principle about bodies and the spaces they occupy writes itself in the wet light. From time to time, a packet of letters arrives from a Sicilian with a stubborn mind who builds on the same principles. The correspondence is copied, argued with, extended and tucked into a drawer marked not with a title but with a feeling. This is what it looks like when the world yields a small secret to a careful question. Instruments multiply, but not for vanity. A dioptra, a sighting frame with a rotating scale, walks from the harbour to the roof and back again as surveyors, astronomers and engineers take turns. A portable sundial, no larger than a palm, tilts like a flower to the right latitude and gives the hour with enough accuracy to warn a lecturer that he's about to talk into supper. A set of standard weights sits in a locked chest with seals from temple and palace. Arguments end more quickly in the presence of a kilogram disguised as a bronze duck. Science here is not a column of marble. It is a bench worn smooth where elbows learn to lean. A mathematician wanders into a room where poets test metaphors, borrows the word arc with a smile, and leaves chord behind like a gift. A sailor fresh off a Rhodian run describes to a geographer how currents pinch a strait, and a small correction appears on the next map that keeps a ship from grinding against rock in a month no one thought dangerous. An herbalist gives a star watcher a recipe for keeping dew off lenses that fog in a sea breeze. These trades make a discipline feel less like a tower and more like a market with honest scales. Across the arcade, the body is studied with the same tenderness given to triangles and stars. The clinic opens its shutters to the garden where plants grow not as decorations but as partners in speech. A teacher runs a finger along the underside of his forearm and names a river of sensation that begins in the neck. He taps at the wrist and finds a beat that changes with fear, fever, and excitement. The language for these phenomena is taught like a second alphabet. Artery, vein, nerve. 3 kinds of channels, 3 kinds of traffic. In a city that counts time in many ways, someone brings a water clock and measures the interval between beats, notes how a fever quickens it and a deep breath calms it, and writes a small table that later will seem obvious. Anatomy has rooms that smell of clean linen and oil, rooms where silence is a kind of respect. A cutter's hand is steady and his mind full of maps. He names the membranes and tubes that protect or convey and refuses to call them by the wrong names, even when doing so would simplify a lecture. He shows the small doors inside the heart that open one way, like modest shopkeepers, and he wonders aloud what traffic they prefer. He places a reed in a severed vessel and blows. Nothing moves backward. He traces a nerve to the hand and pricks the palm. The fingers leap, a shy consent that becomes a principle when repeated gently and carefully 12 times. In his notes he writes neither triumph nor gore, he writes, "From this I infer." Students learn to listen with fingertips. A child with a winter cough breathes against a physician's ear pressed to his back. The sound tells a story about moisture, about where the breath sticks and where it slides, and the prescription that follows is not magic. Warmth, rest. A poultice that smells of time because time persuades a tight chest to open. In the herb garden, a girl crumbles dried leaves between her fingers and speaks their names in 3 languages so that in the market she will not buy a stranger to stand in for a friend. She learns which plants love the riverbank and which prefer the courtyard stone, because medicine is botany with a purpose. Recipes live in notebooks that look like diaries. Almond oil thickened with beeswax becomes a salve for cracked heels. Wine infused with bitter bark is counted into drops above a feverish tongue. The dose adjusted for a boy's small frame and a soldier's breadth. A list grows of incompatibilities, not as law but as folk wisdom tested into rule. This resin quarrels with that root. This metal vessel wakes a poison in a brew that rested harmlessly in clay. The kitchen and the clinic share a door and a respect for heat. Surgery is taught like carpentry, with jigs and practice before the real work. A teacher shows how to splint a forearm so bone ends do not grind. The lashing follows the grain of limb and cloth alike. He keeps a basket of carved wooden joints to demonstrate range of motion and to predict danger. A ligament does not thank a man who tests it beyond its patience. When knives are used, they are used with the restraint of someone who has watched wounds teach their own terrible classes. In the corner, a bundle of clean cobwebs waits as an astringent for capillary bleeds. The surgeon's pride rests not in bravery, but in hemostasis. Debate is as gentle and exacting here as in the halls of poets. Does the brain rule the limbs, or does the heart speak the louder law? A teacher places a hand on his own crown and another under his breastbone and answers with the kind of smile that leaves the room for revision. Attend to the brain when the hand will not obey, to the chest when the breath will not settle. He shows where a nerve can be pinched by habit at the neck, and how a man's sadness improves when his posture does. He keeps an account of cases in a tidy hand that future readers can read without meeting the man. Age, climate, diet, complaint, course, outcome. The role lies beside a tragedy in the library and is treated with equal seriousness. The city's plural tongue serves medicine well. An Egyptian midwife speaks in her own words of the meanings of colours in the face of a labouring woman and the tempo of a birth that chooses its own hour. A Greek physician writes down the observations without smoothing their edges, then tests them in his own rounds until they harden into advice he can teach. A Babylonian table of auspicious days for surgery is read with a straight face and then annotated by a practical surgeon. Most infections follow the bad water after the flood. Avoid cutting then. Instruments are modest and well kept. A box of bronze probes and hooks lies on a linen cloth. Their edges are attended to as if language depended on them. Cupping vessels are warmed over coals. The skin under them flushes in circles that look like punctuation. A cautery iron waits in a small brazier for the rare moment when a vessel will not stop sighing blood. Afterward the room smells faintly of vinegar and smoke, the scent of averted disasters. The body's innards teach the rhythm of prudence. A teacher opens a small animal to show how loops of intestine find order in a crowded place, which way the valves fold to keep food's river moving, how a stomach's lining protests insult and how long it forgives before scarring into silence. He never storms a boundary without naming it first, and reminding the room that what is learned at cost must be spent with care. He keeps a roll of errors, anonymized and honest. The afternoon he mistook one swelling for another, and what he learned in the aftermath. Students read this with the same attention they give to Euclid's fifth postulate, because both teach about lines that look straight and are not. Between the halls, science and medicine exchange courtesies. An astronomer lends a water clock to a physician to count pulses and returns it the next day with a note. Your patients breathe faster at dusk. Is it fear? The physician writes back, perhaps, or perhaps the wind shifts and brings dust. The geographer asks the clinic for reports on agues along certain canals. The answers help him reroute a channel around a swamp that oozes fever in late summer. The mathematician who loves circles calculates the volume of a decoction pot, then marks a line inside that means 1 dose for 3, saving a young assistant from arithmetic on a day when his hands are trembling. Night finds the 2 wings of the Mousseon working under the same moon. On the roof, a star watcher whispers numbers to a scribe who writes them as carefully as prayers. In the clinic, a nurse counts breaths without moving her lips, and a student, steadying his own nerves, wraps a bandage with a rhythm that would suit a line of verse. The lighthouse performs its slow rotations, signal to sailors, comfort to the sleepless, metronome to those who count. Somewhere in the library a sheet receives a new table, a planet's period, corrected by a single day. And somewhere in the herb room a label is rewritten so the next student will reach for the right jar in the night. Accuracy in this city is a form of kindness. Before dawn, when the water carriers arrive and the lamps are fat with the last inch of oil, a physician stands in the doorway of the anatomy room and listens to the doves on the roof. He thinks, as people here often do, about channels, of blood, of air, of river, of trade, of light from a distant star that has travelled longer than any caravan. He thinks of how the same verbs serve for planets and for pulses: rise, set, quicken, slow. When the next day begins, he will teach his students to make a cup of barley water and to lay a cool hand on a feverish brow. And then he will walk to the eastern peristyle and ask the mathematician to explain again that delightful word he learned yesterday, tangent, because it felt for a moment like a diagnosis. At the western edge of the city, where the hill lifts its shoulder against the wind, a temple rose with a gravity that made even the gulls hesitate. Columns marched in pale ranks. Steps widened until the climb felt ceremonial whether you intended it or not. And inside, in a light kept high and quiet, sat the great image of Serapis, Greek in surface, Egyptian in depth. Around this house of worship flowed smaller rooms and courts, storerooms and studies, porches positioned for shade at every hour. Here the overflow of books from the palace quarter found a second home, and people began to call it the daughter, as if libraries too could be born into families. A visitor stepping past the sacred precinct would smell resin and dry papyrus rather than incense alone. Wooden cupboards lined the side chambers, armoires with doors that fit well against dust, each with neat labels, each holding rolls tied with cords that had learned obedience from long practice. The titles at their ends, Little City Boy, flickered like fish scales when a clerk brushed by. Not all the rolls were grand. Alongside Homer and histories hung lists of canal gates, tables of star risings, small epigrams copied for pleasure, a treatise on fishhooks that some scholar had declared surprisingly fine. The daughter took what the mother could not house, but she also dared to develop her own tastes. Teachers who lived nearer to this hill than to the royal quarter asked for reading copies they could wear thin with classes. Priests attached to the temple learned the cataloguer's art well enough to become priests of order as well as of rites. In a side room cooled by a lattice, copies of the catalogue extended here from the palace. Callimachus' work made portable, annotated with new shelf codes, augmented with local cross-references. A student learned quickly that a book's address could have two versions, one for the royal district, one for the Serapean, and that both were true so long as you read the codes with the right eyes. The shelves often spoke to one another across the city by means of small notes. Our copy of the botanical lexicon agrees with the temple's innate readings and disagrees in two. See the marginalia on plant names that change with soil. This place acquired its own rhythms. In the morning, when the stone steps were still cool, a line of pupils climbed to meet a grammarian who preferred the temple's quiet to the palace's busier courtyards. He taught them to scan verse by tapping the heel of his hand on a roll's wooden rod, a metronome disguised as a habit. In the afternoon, a physician who worshipped here consulted between sacrifices a cabinet of pharmacology whose labels listed Greek, Egyptian, and the vivid description of a leaf's underside that saved mistakes in dim light. And in the long light of evening, a librarian from the main complex often arrived with a basket of rolls tied in pairs, one to keep, one to compare, and then return. The daughter's rooms were not an annex so much as a second mind in the same city. Stories of harm came in gusts over generations, and the Temple Hill learned to bend rather than break. During the siege, when Julius Caesar found himself cornered and set fire to ships near the docks to gain breathing space, the flames ran along the harbour's edges and into warehouses that, among amphorae and rope, sheltered bales of papyrus and stacks of books waiting for inventory. What exactly burned became a problem historians still argue across centuries, but the city understood the lesson in the smell. Ash tastes the same whether it was rope or a roll of Euripides. Runners carried the word up the hill. The temple's librarians tightened doors, moved the more irreplaceable rolls inward, and made quick copies where they could before smoke drifted as far as the Hepta Stadion. Later, when the wind had changed and the sea looked innocent again, scribes collated survivors and wrote small notices into the catalogue. Lost at the harbour, damaged by heat, repaired, replaced from a Rhodian copy, trouble returned in new costumes. In the 3rd century, when the emperor's soldiers fought to pull Alexandria back from a queen who ruled from the Syrian desert, the royal quarter, the Bruchaion, became a battlefield. Stone struck more than argument that year. Streets where scholars had strolled became lines of fire, and buildings that had known only the patience of reading learned the speed of collapse. The daughter on the hill stepped more fully into guardianship. Rolls that could be carried were carried. Others were copied in haste, triaged like patients. When quiet resumed, the city woke to a changed face. Some cabinets in the palace district stood empty. Some shelves in the Serapeum had new labels that did not brag but did not lie. From the royal quarter, after the fighting. The distinction between mother and daughter blurred, not because one ceased to exist, but because the burden of memory moved along the gradient of survival. Years later, a different kind of passion came through the streets. New laws sharpened the air against old gods, and disputes that had played out in books began to play out in crowds. The great temple became a prize in the argument about what a city should worship. When the order came to level the idol and sanctify the space for a new allegiance, the hill shook not with earthquakes but with people. Stones fell, columns cracked, altars were toppled. In that storm the rooms that held rolls were not spared. Some collections were carted away beforehand by hands that had learned to move quickly in such times. Some were spared by chance. Many were scattered, shelves turned into kindling, cords into whips for dust. Later ages would embroider the tale with a final blaze that consumed everything, as if a city's memory could be murdered in a single afternoon. The truth bears a more human shape. Loss came in chapters, a burned storehouse here, a sacked quarter there, a policy shift that turned budgets to other needs, a long neglect that let worms become librarians. The daughter's end was not a single cliff, it was a coastline eaten by weather, yet the city's scholarship, like water, found other channels. In a house not far from the harbour, a mathematician named Pappus taught and wrote long after the temple's steps grew quieter, compiling a treasury of geometry that remembered older works and sharpened them. In a modest home within the city, Theon edited and explained an astronomer's mighty book. His daughter, Hypatia, taught men who would govern and argue, commenting on conics, on algebra in the seed of its becoming, on the sky's machinery. Her murder in the violence of civic rivalry sent a shock through those who loved reason. But even shocks cannot erase commentaries that had already found readers as far as the islands and beyond. Knowledge had learned to live in many rooms. Even where the rooms failed, the methods did not. The habit of marking suspect lines with calm signs, the art of collating copies and noting their divergences, the discipline of catalogue entries that linked works across subjects. These migrated into other centres with the same quiet power as a graph that takes. Pergamon's shelves on parchment, Rome's private collections that later fed public libraries, Antioch's schools, the villas of wealthy collectors who hired good hands to copy clean texts. They all learned something Alexandrian whether or not they honoured the debt. Centuries later, when monasteries far from the sea copied a geometry text for boys who would never see a lighthouse, the punctuation in the margin and the figure corrected above a proposition carried the fingerprints of a city that had taught people to be courteous to meaning. Some survivals are almost mischievous. A play everyone adored in Alexandria vanished because it was too common to be treasured. A didactic poem copied for a single metaphor a teacher loved slipped through centuries like a seed in a bird's gut and sprouted where no one expected it. The tragedies of Sophocles were edited with devotion. yet most did not live beyond a handful. Comic poets who filled theatres in their day became names without bodies until a roll in desert sand uncurled, millennia later, to let a voice back into air. The loss does not indict a city. It describes the economy of chance and use. A text survives because someone needs it often enough to copy it when the old copy cracks. The most faithful preservative in the world is not reverence, it is utility. Material played its part. Papyrus is a reed tamed into memory, light, flexible, honest, and it thrives where rooms breathe and hands are attentive. In damp, it sighs apart. Parchment, a skin trained to be a page, forgives scraping and overwriting. It can be folded into a codex, sheets stacked and sewn, that invites a reader to leap to the middle without unrolling a yard of thought. As the codex rose, texts easier to consult, outcompeted texts meant to be ceremonially unrolled. A city that had loved the scroll learned to live with the book. In that shift, some works gained a second life because a teacher could carry them more easily. Some were left at the old format's shore because no one took on the labour to copy them into new clothing. The daughter library knew the edges of such transitions as keenly as an artisan feels a change in grain under the knife. Preservation also travelled by translation, as if meaning wore many coats against weather. Greek learning wrapped itself in Syriac, then Arabic, in cities beyond the desert where scholars loved patient questions and spared long hours for commentary. Works by Euclid, Ptolemy, Galen and others were spelled in new alphabets, and then sometimes back into Greek or Latin, bearing improvements and puzzles like souvenirs. An Alexandrian method survived in Baghdad's hospitals and observatories. An Alexandrian habit of cataloguing breathed again in scholars who compiled theorists, book lists, so complete they felt like Phoenix reborn. The road from the Temple Hill to a Damascus study was not a straight line, but the footsteps rhyme. Closer to home, the university that lingered in Alexandria through Roman and early Byzantine centuries, lecture halls more modest than the Museons but still attentive, kept commentaries moving. When a student took notes on a physician's lecture in the 3rd century, and a scribe copied those notes in the 5th, and a monk recopied them in the 9th, the city's cadence persisted even while roofs, laws and languages changed overhead. A marginal sign remained recognisable. A cross-reference still wore its small hook. The myths of total loss attract the mind because they are clean. Reality is messier and more hopeful. The famous tale that a conqueror ordered remaining books burned to heat baths is retold still, with a shiver or a sneer depending on the teller. Historians who frown at stories that answer too perfectly point out how late the tale appears and how neatly it ties a knot that no archive can verify. The true accounting is both sadder and kinder, a centuries-long attrition accompanied by a centuries-long diffusion. The daughter broke because stones break and budgets shift and policies swing, but the city's way of reading taught other cities how to keep flame. On the hill, before the end, there were gestures that deserve remembering because they look small. A librarian, hearing that funds would thin, ordered cords in bulk and repaired cabinet doors so that dust would do less damage during lean years. A priest, protective of the god he served and the books the god conveniently sheltered, hid a handful of medical rolls in a sealed niche to be retrieved when the wind changes. A teacher wrote 2 copies of his own commentary and sent one to a friend in the Delta with a note, "Teach this, do not wait for better times." A porter learned the faces of the most used rolls and without being told, moved them to a shelf faster to reach when a crowd pressed after lecture. These are the anonymous acts that let memory outlive fashion. There were departures that pretended to be ordinary trips. A scholar rolled up a set of diagrams, padded them with his cloak, and took a slow ship to Rhodes, intending to return when the city's temper cooled. He died there, but his diagrams taught a boy who later came back to Egypt with a better word for an angle and a habit of drawing circles that did not wobble. A scribe, dismissed when stipends faltered, hired himself to a merchant family and copied books for their children in winters. The children grew, entered government, and built a small library that lent to friends. A doctor, frightened by a riot outside his clinic, packed his case and 3 rolls into a basket and walked to Canopus. He left the rolls with a temple there where a bored priest with neat handwriting copied them for a season, and then sent them onward with a trader who liked physicians and good stories. The city's knowledge had learned to travel as a passenger long before anyone declared it homeless. Some evenings, after the temple had lost its idol, but before the labour of copying stopped entirely, an old librarian sat on the steps and watched the wind shear the tops of date palms. He could still entangle arguments about meter or anatomy with a skilled flick of his wrist. He could still retrieve a roll from behind his shoulder without looking. When a boy asked him if the library would vanish, he laughed in the soft way of a man who has read too long to be dramatic. "Buildings die," he said. "Methods migrate. If you know how to ask a text a careful question and how to leave a small sign in the margin that helps the next reader, you have the library in your hands. The city is not just stone, it is the way we agree to be exact." He did not say this to console. He had lived through the taste of ash and could distinguish it from the taste of sea salt. He had watched a catalogue's page go blank where a book's address had been. He had moved shelves himself the day the priest whispered, "Bring what you can." He spoke as a craftsman whose craft had outlived several patrons. He reminded the boy of the rule that mattered most in thin times. Copy what you use, teach what you copy, place what you teach where someone can find it. The boy nodded solemnly, and as boys do, stored the instructions somewhere he would not know he had kept it until much later. In the centuries that followed, readers who never climbed those steps still breathed the city's air. A Latin student bent over Euclid in a distant monastery and traced a neat diagram with a goose quill. The clarity he felt came through Alexandrian hands that had learned to define before they proved. A physician in Gundishapur counted a pulse with a water clock's drip and wrote his case notes in a tidy list, a habit that had been a librarian's preference before it became a medical standard. A cataloguer in Baghdad made a list of all the books he could reach and the places they slept, and sprinkled it with short lives of authors and warnings about false titles. The lines of his hand rhymed with Callimachus without asking permission, and yet even rhyme can be heard again in the city that taught it. On a dawn like any other, long after the temple stones had been hauled away to make a different sort of building, a fisherman's grandson carried a roll he had found in a hole in the hill to a scribe who still worked in a small shop near the water. The roll smelled of old cedar, older dust. The scribe warmed it over a little pot to ease the curl and unrolled it finger width by finger width. The first line appeared, then another, then a familiar margin sign, and the 2 men smiled at each other, because the sign was like seeing a friend step from a crowd. The text was not famous. It was a plain handbook of measures. How many hecat to a sack, how far a man can carry 8 artabus of grain without harm, how to set a fair exchange when one calendar lurches and another stands steady. The scribe copied it. The fisherman's grandson traded it for a coin and a story to tell his children, and the small book went into a chest where a customs clerk later kept it beside a tax list. If no one sang of that rescue, it is only because the hero wore a shop apron. Even now, when readers speak of the library as if it were a single room that once blazed and went dark, you can feel the city smile in the corner of history. The truth is more like a constellation than a lighthouse. Scattered lights that, when connected by the right tradition, make a shape you can navigate by. The daughter library's gifts were not only the rolls that slept on its shelves, they were the habits it taught to anyone who ever lowered their voice in deference to a text, whoever wrote a careful question in a margin, whoever built a cupboard with doors that kept dust out because attention is a sacred thing. On certain winter nights when the wind through the alleys has the clean edge of something older than politics, you can imagine the footfall of a porter on the temple steps, the creak of a cupboard door, the hush of linen untying, the small intake of breath when a familiar hand meets an unfamiliar opening line. A city is not just where those sounds once happened. It is any place where they still can. And so a scholar in a far century opening a modest book with a careful hand finds herself in Alexandria for a moment, not by myth, but by method, and a daughter library opens its doors again without needing to be rebuilt.